Hey everybody, this is Ben Botkin. In this video, I want to talk a little bit about Orchestral Tools library Metropolis Ark 2. And I want to show you a little bit of a screen capture of a demo that I wrote for this library a few years ago when it came out, and this piece is called The Upward Call. So what I want to do in this library is, like I said, do a little bit of a screen capture of this demo and talk a little bit about some of the compositional concepts behind this demo, some performance things that maybe you can implement in your own compositions. But then I also want to talk about this really awesome library and break it down section by section and get into some of the things that I think are really strengths of this library. So just regarding the colors of the Midi here, just so you can know this as you follow along, green are strings, the lighter blue is piano and harp, the dark blue is woodwinds, the purple is choir, yellow is percussion, and red is brass. So let's go ahead and give this a play. Alrighty, so let's talk a little bit about this demo. First off, some funny history behind this demo. When Orchestral Tools first reached out to me about writing a demo for this, because I'd written a demo for Metropolis Ark 1, I guess about a year earlier, and some of their other libraries as well. When they asked me about this library, I didn't know basically anything about the stated purpose of the library or the angle of the library. It was just like, we're doing Metropolis Ark 2. Now maybe they said some stuff to me that I didn't hear or just kind of went over my head. But basically, I didn't know that the angle on this library was Orchestra of the Deep. I just thought, hey, I'm just going to play with these samples and I'm going to come up with something that I think the samples suggest, something that just seems to take advantage of the sounds in this library that inspire me. So I ended up doing this thing that's like very beautiful, very light, kind of ethereal, which is kind of a little bit different from what the intended purpose of the library was. So I just thought that was kind of funny. But I think it does speak to the fact that while some of the marketing for this library was that it would be kind of like dark, ominous stuff, It really is a beautiful, beautiful library. Where Metropolis Ark 1, which, as you may know, focuses on offering a lot of really interesting colors and unique ensemble sizes. This library kind of continues that same concept, but instead of emphasizing the upper end of the dynamic range, the more fortissimo end, this is the pianissimo end. This is the quieter dynamic range. So like mezzo piano to triple P. That's kind of dynamically where this library is camping out in terms of how they recorded these instruments. And that means that it's got a very soft sound, a very beautiful sound. It also means it has a very full sound, because something that's interesting that happens is typically when you're playing an instrument at a higher dynamic, it creates a brighter, more piercing sound. But if you play an instrument at a lower dynamic, usually it makes a mellower, warmer sound. Now, if you take that high dynamic, let's say a triple F, and that very low dynamic, let's say that triple P, and you normalize the volume so they're equally loud, what you'll find is that the softer sounds have a much wider or a much broader sound because they actually fill the soundscape in a fuller, rounder way. They're not like little piercing stabs in your pitch spectrum. So, and this is a technique that Hans Zimmer has talked about when he wants really big, really full percussion and stuff. One of the things that he'll do is try to sample percussion at the lowest possible dynamic because it gets the biggest, fullest sound in some ways. So this library does have a very full, very warm, and delicious sound to it. Now, one other thing regarding the sound of this library I want to mention is that everything you're hearing in this demo is only Metropolis Ark 2. And that's what they requested. Can you do a demo that's using only this library, only using the toolkits included? And this library is kind of like, I view it as kind of an additional library to your standard bread and butter strings, brass, winds, percussion, if you're an orchestral cinematic composer like I am. But that said, it's got a pretty broad range of sounds and ensembles and textures. And there's really a lot in this library. So one of the things I should probably just say up front is this video is coming out a few years after this library was originally released and produced. So that means there's a lot of other videos and there's a lot of info on the Orchestral Tools site that gives you specifics about everything that's included in the library, all the features of the library. And my intention is not to go into all that stuff, not to just give you all the information you can find on the product page. I'm going to try to isolate and talk about some of the things that I think make this library really special and are unique strengths of this library. So anyway, back to talking about the sound. One reason I think why this demo, sonically, it works really well is that it is only the one library. And so everything's in the same space. Everything just gels nicely. So now, just so you know, you might be wondering how out of the box is this sound in this demo. So let me just pull up my mixer for a second so you can see. I have I have one of my favorite instances of Quantum Leap Spaces, the Hamburg Cathedral, as one of my favorite impulses just for like a long haul tail, which I really wanted, especially on the choir. I just really wanted it to be in a super wet location, even though these instruments are already in a pretty roomy space. They already sound pretty big. I wanted to give a little extra. So as you can see, there's some moderate reverb applied to the sounds that you're hearing, and a tiny bit of EQ. Looks like we have a little bit on the woodwinds and a little bit on the strings just to tame the higher end and to make them a little bit, add a little bit of silkiness by dipping around that 5,000 hertz range, just to make the strings a little bit silkier. But if I bypass, if we do like an A-B comparison and I just go ahead and I bypass everything that I'm doing, with EQ and reverb, I mean, it's going to sound like this. Bass, pretty similar. Let's go to the big part. So you can hear the sound of the samples continuing to reverberate. Now, if I turn the our reverb back on, it sounds like this. Hear that hall? So anyway, as you can see, it's not making a massive difference, but I just wanted to give you a little bit of a taste for what the out-of-the-box sound sounds like, and just to show you that even though I have I've put a little reverb on, a little more on some instruments than others, in some sections than others, and I've got a tiny bit of EQ, but basically what you're hearing is the out-of-the-box sound of the library that you'll hear if you get this library and you start it up. This is basically what it's going to sound like. But I went ahead and reactivated the reverb and that EQ just so that for the rest of this video, you are hearing this orchestra, you're hearing this piece the way I heard it when I wrote it. So those are just a few notes about the sound that I wanted to point out. Regarding the composition of this piece, it kind of has three sections. There's our first section of where piano takes center stage, and this is I really like this. Really nice piano. I'll talk about that more in a minute. So the first third is, like the first full statement of the melody is piano with some more ethereal textures behind it. And we'll talk about textures because there's some really nice ones in this library. And then choir, because choir the choir is the part of this library that I probably use the most in the rest of my other compositions. And something I mentioned in my Metropolis Ark 1 overview video is that while Metropolis Ark 1 is very focused on those like triple F dynamics, and it's really great for epic music, I actually end up using Metropolis Ark 2 patches in my regular compositions more often because a lot of my composition is not epic trailer stuff. The majority of it is for dramatic films. And so most of the time you're using kind of the middle of the dynamic range or the lower end of the dynamic range, and it's a little more subtle. So we're not having massive 9 French horn fanfares in most of the feature films that I'm writing. And I'm not writing blockbusters. So it's not the Avengers music. It's not that style and that scope. So for most of my uses, I find I'm going to Metropolis Ark 2 more often, and not because it's better, but because it's got that softer dynamic range. It's got the really nice middle and a really nice softness. So the middle part is choir, and the last main part is kind of where we pull out all the stops and we get like the full breadth and width of the library, and then we finish with just like a little tail that's kind of an echo or reprise of our original idea. So basically a very simple structure. The dynamic shape of this piece is basically a continuous, more or less a continuous crescendo. It just starts small, gets a little bigger, gets quite big, pause, and then just like a little refrain. So a very simple structure and shape to this piece. And one thing I like about this piece from a compositional perspective is, even though it's not a very long piece, I like the amount of restraint that I used. And I did save a lot of the pitch spectrum, like the broadest extremities of it, low and high, I did save for the climax. And I'm glad that I did that because I think like once this big third act in the piece hits you, it feels like, whoa, something like I just got this big wash of emotion, which is what I really, and I like how that worked. I think I actually like, even though I don't always like my mixing jobs from a few years later, I actually do really like the way I mix this piece and just how this big third section hits you. So anyway, just a compositional note to implement in your own pieces. Just something that I find is helpful is to look forward in my composition and in my structure to where are the parts that need to be really big, where are the parts that need to be really small, where are the parts that need to be really dense, where are the parts that need to be sparse, and plan backwards from those points. And that's good because that gives you time to get your listener ready for that, to anticipate those big moments if you're going to be having elements crescendoing up to that climactic point. But this also gives you the opportunity to create contrast. So if you know, okay, in 8 bars, I've got my big fullness moment. Okay, if I want that to really feel big, I'm going to want something smaller before we get there. So we've got the dynamic of contrast, and we can really take advantage of the dynamic contrast. So anyway, that's just a note about dynamic restraint. And you don't have to use your entire pitch spectrum all the time. You may want to, one trick I like to use is just not using my double basses much, and then just bringing my double basses in like an octave below my cello, just when I really want that extra dimension of depth to just really come in and like draw the listener deeper. We'll talk about strings more in a minute, but that's just some compositional notes about restraint and structure. And finally, from a composition sort of perspective, I want to talk a little bit about the rubatos and the timing, because as you may have noticed as you listened, there's quite a bit of rubato in this performance. And the reason for that is basically when I was taking piano lessons and I was learning how to play the piano and how to express on the piano, I was taught, and this is not just me, this is pretty much standard, especially in the classical music worlds, is that your sense of time and timing is one of your most powerful expressive tools. So your ability to speed up, to slow down, to give a pause, to give a breath, to rush a little bit. These are all tools in the toolkit of expression. And sometimes people who come from some more modern genres kind of miss out on this whole element of expression a little bit. And like here in Nashville, I live in the Nashville area. I was talking to an audio engineer who said, well, Nashville is just a click town. Everything is done to a click. And I'm like, okay, well, do they put tempo fluctuations in that click? And he said, like, no, it's just like a straight click. It's 90 BPM from the beginning to the end or whatever. And I don't know how fairly he's representing the whole city and all the recording techniques, but I thought that was interesting and also sad to think about, because I feel like, man, there's just so much depth we can get out of those pauses and those breaks and that rushing. There's just, it's sad to me that if we just do this completely steady thing tempo-wise, which sometimes is fine and appropriate, but just we're missing out on an entire dimension of musical expression. So what I usually do is I'll compose a piece of music to my grid, to a tempo track, and then I will manually create the rubatos, the crescendos, the ritardandos that I want, penciling them in, and then listening again, and then penciling, and then listening again, and adjusting it, and listening it again, and just trying to figure out, okay, does this feel like a natural amount of time to give the rest to? So if you'll see where I'm using this, I speed up a little bit, and there's a little bit of a gradual crescendo moving up to our climax, because I wanted the feeling of the piece to just be getting a little bit faster, just a little bit of forward momentum, just a little extra. But you'll see the most common thing that I'm doing in the tempo track is a rubato, a bird's eye, and I almost always do this same kind of dip. And that I find is the most at the end of a phrase, like at the end of your 4 or 8 bar sequence, this is like the most natural place to put those bird's eyes, put those retards. So let's just listen to a little bit of this piece and watch what's going on here with the timing. I'll back up a little for context. Continuing to speed up just very slightly as we move towards our climax. But again, even though we're very gradually speeding up, I'm still giving extra rubato space for us to like really taste those breaths. And I think I did this even more than normal because of the choir writing I was doing. If I remember correctly, like the same winter I wrote this demo, I had just sung in a little local church choir, which is the first time that I'd done that. I'm not really a singer, but it was a new experience for me. And it just gave me a bit of an extra appreciation for just some of the like choral phrasing that happens, and just how like the ends of phrases are just really tasted, and you're just like given a moment to enjoy that. So, anyways, as you can see, there's a lot of these rubato moments, and especially at the end of a more dynamic sequence. So. And there's a couple different ways rubatos are programmed. One thing that's common is if you're going to be giving this music to a group of live musicians, and they're going to be following some kind of a click. What would probably happen in this case, instead of keeping it in 4/4, but just doing an extreme slowdown for the extra time, you probably turn it into like a 6/4 bar, or add a 2/4 bar in here, so that the tempo stays basically the same, and that we're creating the extra time with extra bars and extra beats. And that's a little bit easier to follow if you're performing along with the click track. So this kind of really extreme stuff, like I do right here, within the same time signature, is fine if you're doing this by yourself. But if you're creating music, extreme rubatos for musicians, you should probably write it out so it's not an extreme of a dip inside this bar, but instead you would just give you make this a 5/4 or a 6/4 bar, and just give an extra beat or two so that the general tempo stays about the same. So anyway, there's just a few notes about rubatos. Play with them. Try doing just straight lines. Try doing curves. I tend to do straight lines for crescendos and diminuendos, but for like bird's eyes, I almost always do a curve down. It's always a curve. Is that the best? I don't know, but that's just works well for me. So moving on, we've talked about a little bit about this piece. Let's go ahead and start jumping into this library, Metropolis Ark 2, because there's a lot here. And actually, this video could end up being super long because there's a lot of stuff I really like. First off, we'll talk about strings, because that's up at the top of the library. That's at the top of my my piece. Like Metropolis Ark 1, this is not a sectional library, so you don't have first violins, second violins, violas, cello, and double bass. You have high strings, you have mid strings, and then you have low strings, which is actually more of a division than you have in Ark 1. Ark 1 was just high strings and low strings, and the viola cello range kind of is underrepresented, or at least the cello range is sort of the mid upper cello range. So there's some legatos. I'm actually using 3 versions of the same patch just to get more of a chordal I have octaves, and I wanted them to be legato, so I just opened up 3 instances of the same patch. And I saved this, just a note about the arrangement of this final crescendo, I mean, this final big moment in the piece. I really wanted it to be big and strong, but I knew I wanted my strongest moment to be the very last. It's like da 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 da. I wanted the final da 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 to be the strongest one, so I kept like the top 2 octaves in strings open until I got to that last statement right here, and then I brought that in. So take a listen. And that just really brings it to the next level. It's like we really deepen and broaden the lower end, and the middle, we're just like really milking that middle. And then as soon as we get to this end, we just elevate with those strings, because we leave those octaves not completely filled. We have stuff there, but there's room for strong melody there. So I kept that, and then wanted to use that space right at the most climactic, biggest moment of the piece. And that's just the sort of thing where planning, a little bit of planning in advance can really pay dividends in your orchestration and your arrangement. Anyway, that's an aside. So strings, the legatos. Those are actually pretty nice. My main string libraries at this point are Cinematic Studio strings and soaring strings. So I don't actually go to these strings that often, but they do have a really nice sound. But in terms of like my bread and butter string patches, I'm usually going to those other libraries. Now, so like where I end up using this library a lot is in some of the unusual articulations, some of the textures. So it's got, high strings spiccato. Oh, the spiccatos are really nice, actually, across the board. Especially the mid, should say mid, spiccato. So those have a really nice sound. The low string spiccato, these are in octaves. Kind of the same concept as Metropolis Ark 1, but at a lower dynamic range. So these spiccatos do have a really nice sound. The mid strings legato, kind of same concept as the high strings, but I think these have got some violas in the mix. So that's a decent legato, a nice sound. Multi patches. Let's take a look at this guy. What do we got here? Now, don't tell anyone, but even though this is several years later, I'm still actually using the beta of this library that I got when I wrote the demo. That's because I don't like downloading hundreds of gigabytes, or I can't remember how big this library is, but I don't like re-downloading stuff all the time. These actually have a really nice sound. No vibrato. think that's with some vibrato. There's a lot of really neat, kind of unusual articulations in here. So I'll show you, I won't do this for every patch, but I will for the strings just to show you a little bit of the breadth in this library. And some of these special articulations are where I love having this library as an extra toolkit of sounds. This is like a slow tremolo. That's just a really nice texture. A faster tremolo, it's like that's a more of a standard normal tremolo that you'd have in a string library. Long swells. Short swells. Collegno. And this is, what is this? Ooh, check that puppy out. It's really cool atmospheric textures. Violas. Violas fast. We'll go back to our original just sustains. Now I'll show you, I'll just to give you a little bit of an idea of how these strings sound. And if I was writing with just strings, I'd probably voice this a little bit differently. But hey, let's take a listen at just these sort of longer strings. So you can hear, there's two more things I want to talk about with these strings. Those low strings, like these low string legatos. When you put them in a mix like this, like way down at the bottom, sometimes you just feel them. Like they have a presence that maybe you don't hear super clearly, but it adds weight. It adds a presence in the low end that's felt, and you feel it deeply. So I love these. I'm actually using, in this big moment, I'm using this low strings multi-patch. Actually, I think it's the same, effectively the same thing as this. I'm not sure why I didn't just use that. Anyways, one thing that's a texture I really like, and I'm using a lot in this piece, is actually an arpeggio texture. So it's really nice just to keep this as a sustain, or even to play chords with it. And what an evocative sound. Moving on to harp and piano, speaking of texture, there's a lot of it in here. So we have a couple different things. A harp multi, and this is no regular harp. This is actually 6 harps in unison. Harp Tremolo, it's actually, it's really cool. Again, like a sustained texture, which is really great for chords. This piano, the solo piano, is just... The upper end is just really crystalline, really light. It can carry a melody with just a single note. Or you can play it for kind of these slower, softer passages. And again, this is at the lower dynamic end of the piano. And then this patch is multiple pianos again, kind of like the concept between with the harp ensemble. This is, what is this? Yeah, 3 pianos. So you can, put like a 10-second reverb on that, and there you've got your little solo piano. You got your little single piano note sound for your trailer music, which is now like almost out of fashion. There's also a piano tremolo, same deal as the harps. Really nice sounds. I mean, you can just sustain these chords out for a long time, mix this with something else, maybe a really soft like synth pad, and it's just, you've got that motion. And these are so great because you can add motion to like these really long sustains. And in film scoring and dramatic scoring, for documentaries or whatever, that's just having those kinds of evolving textures is really wonderful. And so these are great for that. Mix them with some sustained strings. Or you'll grab these guys, and then the arps. And let's see what we can make here. Just gorgeous, gorgeous stuff. And this is all at really low dynamic ranges, so there's just a lot of air. I love this patch. This is, what's the actual name of this? Piano A3, 5th chords. It's a very James Horner kind of thing. Like if he had this, he'd use it all the time. So these are really nice. Lots of really cool textures and effects that are just super, super useful to have layered with something else or even on their own. Woodwinds. So one thing that's interesting about this library is the sections and the instruments that it decides to use are very unconventional once you get past the strings. So taking a look at the woodwinds, altos, let's open up this patch. This is 3 alto flutes, legato, and then there's a, and then later we have a multi. Let's put this up here where you can see it. Then we've got multi patches. And you can see there's tons of articulations here again. All kinds of swells and unusual articulations and textures. Actually, let's just open some of those up in a minute. But like these legatos. Really gorgeous. But let me open up that multi-patch. Sustains, no vibrato. With some vibrato. Don't know what the R stands for. Staccatos. Swells. What's that? Oh, flutter tongue. Let's try this. Flutter tongue. Wind noise staccato. Oh, those are great. I forgot about those. Oh, man. Yeah, there's all sorts of stuff in here. I even forgot that was here. Multiphonics. And as you can see, this is not just for the alto flutes. There's like a varied assortment for all these different woodwinds. Yikes, these are so nice. I need to look in here more after this video is over, just for myself. But like a range of really like all kinds of crazy, very cool and unusual articulations, but also just some nice, really nice legatos in unusual ensemble sizes. I mean, where are you going to get? When do you hear 3 bass flutes in unison? Bass clarinets legato. Nah, that doesn't work. The terminal, too fast. I wonder what happens if we add these to our low strings legato. They're not playing in the same register, so you can't hear it so well. Contrabass clarinet legato. Oh my word. Oh my goodness, I'm going all the way down to the B flat, the very lowest B flat on the 88 key keyboard. So the low end is just crazily represented in this library. I'm going to show you a little bit of. There's a moment here I'm doing some big chords with the woodwinds. And these are working with our brass and our strings to try to just make a really strong low end. Now, one thing that was interesting about trying to work with this, actually, I'll wait and talk and play these together in a minute after I talk about the brass. So the brass, the concept behind the brass is kind of the same thing: lower dynamics, unusual ensemble mixtures. So Wagner tubas, 3 of them, legato. So not your regular French horn, trombone, trumpet. You don't have any of those regular brass instruments in this library. And when do you hear 3 of these together? Again, these are unusual sounds and textures that I don't know of really being in any other library. Flugelhorns, 3 of them. Just really nice for these like cello range, French horn range melodies, but it's not a French horn. Kind of in between French horn and trumpet, actually. Some butchered Star Trek. Bass trumpets? Bass trumpets. Okay. It's a little artifact that may only be in the beta, which I am still using. euphoniums. These all have a warmer sound than your trumpet, trombone, bass trombone. And then we have some multis playing chords. So if we listen to those, so we mix those with our low woodwinds. And this is like very unconventional ways of trying to use these sounds. I actually, when I was writing this third part of this piece, I had a really hard time getting it to sound just right and getting the voicing how I wanted it, because I couldn't just use the regular woodwinds and brass the way I usually use them to make a big full low chord. The sounds are different sounds and they're different sizes of ensemble. So I had to play around a little bit until I got a sound I really liked. So that's just something to be aware of. And again, that's not a downside to the library. It's just actually coming out of its strength is that it's unique. And so it needs a little bit of unique treatment to get the most out of it. But man, there's just so much warmth. There's so much warmth and power in that, and some of those low instruments are just great. And then once we mix it with everything else as well, anyway, so I'll move on and I'll talk about now what is probably my absolute favorite part of this library, and that is the choir. So a similar in the Metropolis Ark 1 choir, you have a high choir, which is a women's choir, and a low choir, which is obviously a men's choir. That's how it's divided up. And it's very loud, epic sound, the higher end of the dynamic range. This is softer. The legatos are, I think, a little bit slower, or maybe about the same, but it's really gorgeous. Let me play a section of the middle. These legatos are just amazing. It's just great. This children's legato. Women's legato. Then the men's has like this really amazing quality to it. Ah, it's just so full. And then the marcatos, the staccatos and the marcatos, kind of like Metropolis Ark 1, it cycles through a number of the round robins are different not phrases, different syllables. Men's staccato, same concept. And the marcatos as well cycle through a number of different syllables. Women's. Or maybe it doesn't. I thought it did. I think the men's does. Listen. It's not, for some reason it's not, but I thought that it did. But anyway, you can see the sound it's just got a really wonderful warm sound. The legatos are amazing. The sorts are nice. The sustains are great. And the marcatos, which is what I'm using for this part, have an incredible sound. To be honest, I could program this better. In isolation, it's just going to sound kind of fake, but... those attacks, at least. But the sound of the samples is amazing. And when you mix that with everything else, you can't really hear that the attacks don't sound that great in the performance that I created. Anyway, all around, it's just an incredible library. There's also a percussion section, which I didn't use tons of. It's just got a lot of really low, powerful boomers. Percussion ensemble. And this stuff is at such a low dynamic layer. The dynamics are so low and make such a wide sound that a little bit of this goes a really long way. Deep drums. Oh man. Some bowed metal. I don't think they're already cymbal swelled, so I did something kind of creative, and it doesn't sound great on its own, but it does add a little bit in context. I actually just like made a glissando with this. Because I didn't have like a reverse cymbal sort of transition sweep, so I did that. It's not the most amazing thing, but I didn't have a certain patch that I wanted, and since I had to use just this library, that's one thing I did. It's not actually the best way to do this, but you know, It is what it is. Percussion effect. Waterphone effects. Synth effects. There's a lot in this library, and I'm not going to go through everything. If you want to find out more about it, go to the Orchestral Tools website and look at the included articulations, the included patches, to see what it has, to see what it can do. And this is a really special library. I mean, Metropolis Ark 1, if you're going to be doing a bunch of epic music, big trailer stuff, Metropolis 1 is a must-have. If you're not doing a whole bunch of big epic stuff, Metropolis Ark 1 may not be a must-have. But if you're doing a lot of film scoring stuff, and it's more moderate dynamics, quieter dynamics, I would say Metropolis Ark 2 is it a must-have. I mean, there's so many great libraries out there, but it's really special. And I would be super bummed if I didn't have this as part of my palette. And even as just going through this library today, I'm uncovering all kinds of sounds and textures that I forgot were even here. And now I'm like, oh my goodness, I need to go back. I need to revamp my template with some of this stuff, because some of this is just, it's really gold. So anyway, there is my, turns out not so brief, basically hour-long overview of Metropolis Ark 2 and this demo that I wrote. I hope that you enjoyed it. If you did, I'd appreciate a like, subscribe if you want to see more content like this in the future, or a comment. You know, if you like the piece, let me know. If you've got any questions about the library, you know, feel free to ask. So thank you so much for joining me on this video, and I look forward to seeing you next time.